For decades, the world has been studying, admiring, and in some cases, fearing China's economic development. Their success story is one of unprecedented growth, sacrifice, and patience. But despite everything that China's built, China is about to face a self-made economic disaster. And what's even sadder is the entire mess was unintentionally created in the pursuit of economic prosperity. By 2050, it's estimated that more than a quarter of Chinese people will be over the age of 65. And unlike other economies, it's unclear who will financially support that generation. Perhaps what's even more alarming is it's not even clear who will replace that generation in the workforce, as China's labor supply is estimated to fall by 20% over the next 3 decades. All of this and much more are direct consequences of the infamous one-child policy, history's most bizarre and perhaps most disturbing attempt at demographic engineering. This video is the first in a series called Decoding History, where we're going to unpack the economic implications behind some of the most notable people, policies, and movements ever. Today, we will explore China's one-child policy and try to understand why it was implemented, whether it achieved its goals, and what its implications for the world's second-largest economy may be. If you want to see more Decoding History videos, let us know by hitting the like button, and if you want to keep up with the new series coming to this channel, be sure to subscribe. Now let's decode some history. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. This marked the birth of a new nation, and from that moment, China underwent a population explosion, as the country grew from 500 million people in the 1950s to 700 million by the 1960s. Meanwhile, Mao was trying to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy to an industrial one, through a set of economic policies called the Great Leap Forward, that imposed a collectivized system for farming and did away with private farming. Ultimately, this failed to produce the necessary yield, and the plan led to a catastrophic famine in 1958 that starved over 50 million people to death and prompted a suicide spree that impacted millions more. The famine also caused a momentary dip in fertility, but by 1966, fertility had started to rise again. The population's growth rate was soaring, and there was a widespread fear of housing shortages and, God forbid, another famine. This motivated the government to begin a birth control propaganda campaign and some efforts to control early marriages, but to no avail. The average family size in China at the time was around 6 people. Then, in 1976, Mao died after suffering several heart attacks, leaving an imminent disaster for his successor, Deng Xiaoping, to govern. The population stood at a whopping 969 million people, putting a severe strain on water, electricity, and food. And so on the 25th of September in 1980, the Communist Party of China implemented the one-child policy, a soon-to-be obvious mistake that went on to stand for 35 years. Posed as a solution to control the country's rapidly growing population, it sought to improve quality of life, increase GDP per capita, and avoid future famines. It was the ultimate gamble for economic prosperity. Under the policy, most couples were allowed to have only one child. Those who violated the policy had to pay harsh penalties, often larger than their annual income, and in rare occasions, notable figures who violated the policy were made to pay over $1 million. On top of fines, those who violated the policy by having more than one child would also be subject to sanctions like the seizure of property or being blocked from accessing government services like schools, healthcare, and financial services. Many companies even refused hiring people with more than one child. It's also particularly difficult to appropriately describe the inhumane consequences imposed upon women in China during the one-child policy, as the government didn't just deter childbirths with sanctions and fines. They went out of their way to prevent them in the first place. Women were forcefully sterilized, their menstruation cycles closely surveilled. If they did get pregnant with a second child, they were forced to have abortions. And because of this, more than 336 million abortions had been reportedly performed to maintain the one-child policy. So China willingly implemented this radical policy, and with it came a whole host of institutionalized human rights concerns. But remember, they did it in the pursuit of economic prosperity for a future China. to avoid famine and increase the quality of life. So did this gamble pay off economically? Was this a visionary idea despite the collateral damage, or just a total failure? We are now about to dive into the shocking economic implications of the one-child policy right after today's segment of History on Repeat. Hearing about China's one-child policy, it's certainly easy to exceptionalize China's authoritarian imposition and disregard for personal autonomy. But it's not the only country to implement population control policies. In India in 1975, during a period referred to as the emergency,
it has proclaimed emergency. This is nothing to panic about.
Sanjay Gandhi, son of the former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, began a gruesome campaign to sterilize poor men, with reports of police corroding off entire villages and dragging men to surgery. In just 1 year, 6.2 million men were sterilized to prevent further reproduction. That's 15 times the number of people sterilized by the Nazis. India thus has its own dark history of state-sponsored population control, but you don't have to look back half a century to see that history repeats itself in many forms. Less than 10 years ago, India carried out nearly 4 million sterilizations between 2013 and 2014. But this time, less than 100,000 of those were done on men. Now, as we promised, let's dive into the economic consequences of China's one-child policy. In 2011, the Chinese government proclaimed that the one-child policy had prevented 400 million births, likely the most significant feat of population engineering ever. One consequence of this was it produced the most educated and privileged generations in China's history. This is because all the resources of a typical family were channeled into just one child. But when China finally repealed the policy in 2015, the most dangerous consequences had not yet come to light. China's efforts to combat an exploding population have created an arguably worse problem, a soon-to-be declining one. Although China's population is still growing today, and its largest population segment includes earners and spenders powering the economy, this demographic will soon retire, and around the same time, China's population will begin to shrink. You see, in the 1990s, 1 in every 8 Chinese citizens had no siblings. By 2050, it's estimated that 1 in every 3 citizens will not have any siblings. While many siblingless people will have grandparents, parents, they won't have any uncles, no aunts, no cousins. This creates what's referred to as the 4-2-1 family type after just 2 generations, and 8-4-2-1 type after 3. This is a huge problem, and a problem you can think of like an inverted pyramid, with increasing financial pressure and strain on the bottom to support the top. By 2013, elderly people comprised only 12% of the population. By 2050, that number is expected to rise to 34%. That's more than 1 in every 3 people, and by 2050, China is expected to have more retirees than Germany, Japan, France, and the UK combined. This aging population poses a serious threat to China's economy, which relies heavily on competitive labor. With fewer children being born, the working age population has shrunk, resulting in a severe shortage of labor. The shortage led to increased wages, which in turn led to higher production costs for Chinese manufacturing, which, if you've seen our most popular economic oddness video, you know Chinese manufacturing is already losing market share to competitive emerging economies. There's also a fear that China's economy will become less innovative, as young adults are also major drivers of entrepreneurship, a key driver of growth in the 21st century among most major economies. Finally, and perhaps most notably, the one-child policy exacerbated gender inequality, especially amongst poor couples who felt that a son, rather than a daughter, would be able to provide more for the family in the future. This led to a mass cultural rejection of girls who were seen as incapable of working the farm, earning an income, and carrying the family name. As a result, millions of female babies were given up for adoption, aborted, or murdered. By 1990, the one-child policy was responsible for 50 million missing women in China and 100 million worldwide. Today, there are not nearly enough girls and women in China, and by 2050, 1 in every 4 Chinese men above the age of 50 will not have a spouse. And for the 40 million men who will be in their 30s, almost half of them will not have a spouse. The implications of this are catastrophic, ranging from higher levels of criminality and sex trafficking to increased outmigration of young people, and perhaps the most difficult implication for China to grapple with, this will mean even fewer births. In 2020, there were only 12 million births, the lowest number ever recorded in China. The Chinese government states that 2.1 births per woman is necessary for a stable population, and currently the number is 1.8. It seems that this grand experiment in population control may have helped China achieve significant economic growth in the short term, facilitating its success story of today, but with a slowing economy, shrinking labor force, unsustainable family structure, and skewed gender ratio, the one-child policy has had largely devastating economic consequences for China. And given its potentially more hazardous future consequences, it's safe to say that China's attempt to forego economic prosperity has majorly backfired.